Greetings. This is the one you've known as Jesus the Christ. You are both human and divine. You are divine perfection expressing as human imperfection, which itself is perfect. You were perfectly designed to be imperfect. Human perfections are an intentional part of your design and will always be with you to some extent. Human imperfections stem largely from the ego, which is an essential aspect of being human that never completely disappears. The ego is not a mistake. It is meant to be part of the human experience. However, it is also intended that you evolve from expressing the ego to expressing your divine nature, while retaining some remnant of ego. These imperfections are the things you might judge about yourself and others. These are also things that cause suffering, such as the tendency to judge, to be unkind, to gossip, to be jealous or envious, to want to be right, to want attention, to try to control others, to compulsively think, to be addicted, to pretend to know, to be selfish or greedy, to blame, to be unaware of or insensitive to other people's needs and feelings, to be prejudiced, to be ignorant, to argue and compete with others. All the things you might be acknowledging when you shrug your shoulders and say, "I'm only human." Because these human tendencies cause problems and pain, most people would prefer they didn't have them. And although your natural evolution is towards greater kindness, empathy, peace, love, wisdom, and other qualities of your true nature, which is perfect, as a human being you will never reach such perfection, and you aren't meant to. To express the perfection of your divine self, the human self doesn't have to be perfect. One of the most important messages I have to offer you is that it's okay for you to be imperfect. It's okay for you to be human, and it's impossible for you to be other than the way you are right now, although you will most certainly continue to evolve and become more Christ-like. You may imagine that I was perfect and hold this up as a model, but you shouldn't be surprised if you or others don't live up to this imagined ideal. I was not perfect either. To some, this must sound like blasphemy, but it is hurtful to you and misleading for you to believe that you or anyone else can become a perfect human being. You can and will become a vehicle for expressing Christ consciousness in the world, but you will still have some human imperfections. As long as you are human, there will be some degree of pull from your programming into fear, anger, judgment, blame, hatred, self-doubt, jealousy, revenge, dissatisfaction, greed, and other human emotions and tendencies. The programming that makes you human is powerfully controlling. Until people begin to question their thoughts, they can't help how they behave. They will follow the dictates of their programming and instincts, not unlike animals. When that happens, you must forgive them, for they know not what they do, and forgive yourself as well. When Christ consciousness shines through the human self doesn't become perfect, but it can become a vehicle for good, at least temporarily, rather than something that serves the ego and its drives and agenda. For Christ consciousness to shine through you, your imperfections don't have to disappear. They simply need to be accepted. This doesn't mean indulging them, however. It means having compassion for them. By showering your imperfections with compassion, you become aligned with your divine self. Then those imperfections disappear for the time being. Many imagine that being in the world but not of it means transcending the world and the ego, and no longer being touched by the difficulties of the human condition. But that is not what this means. Rather, being in the world but not of it means that you fully embrace the world of form and embrace being human, while knowing you are beyond all forms. To do this, you have to first love the world, including your humanness. You have to do the opposite of what the ego does, which is reject the world. The ego rejects the world because it misperceives the world. When you stop seeing the world through the ego's eyes, you will love the world and know it as the magnificent creation and gift that it is. Then the perfection of your divine self can shine through your human self. You will be in the world, but not of the world. As long as you are in the world, as long as you are human, you will have some imperfections, issues, bad habits, and possibly addictions. These won't necessarily take you out of presence unless you judge your human self for having them and think they shouldn't be there. Rejecting, judging, or going to war with your human shortcomings is what keeps you separate from your divine self. When you do those things, you are identified with the superego. Only the superego would go to war with the ego, because doing that accomplishes what the ego wants. It keeps people identified with the false self. The remedy is to become aware of the interplay between these two aspects of your ego and to instead accept your human self. The instant you offer acceptance to your human self, you become your divine self, because the only thing that can do this is the divine self. Sometimes you will fall short of your spiritual goals and ideals. You will not be loving, you will not be compassionate, you will not be patient, you will not be tolerant. You will gossip, lie, exaggerate, judge, blame, and get irritated. You will falter. But once you see that you faltered and accept that, the slate is wiped clean. You are forgiven, and you can begin again. Forgiveness is automatic as soon as you see that you have made a mistake. The seeing of the mistake is the forgiveness. Accepting that mistake will allow you to forgive yourself and move on. You are always forgiven, but if you don't forgive yourself, you'll stay stuck in the ego. Accepting that you made a mistake and that doing so is human allows you to forgive yourself. In that moment of forgiveness, you become a channel once again for Christ consciousness. If you have a negative tendency, such as judging or gossiping, do your best to not indulge in this. But if you do, acknowledge that you've made a mistake, accept that, have compassion for this human tendency, forgive yourself, and ask others for forgiveness if necessary. Then you will drop back into presence, Christ consciousness. To judge or berate yourself only keeps you separate from your divine self. Before you can accept an imperfection which stems from an imperfect thought, such as a judgment, you first have to become aware of that thought. That awareness is the beginning of disidentification from the ego. That little step back, achieved by witnessing thought, is the beginning of realignment with the divine self. This is exactly what is practiced in meditation. You become aware of a thought, you accept that it's there, and you forgive it and yourself for having it. Doing that allows you to return to presence. This is the way from imperfection to perfection. There is no need to do away with imperfection. All that's needed is the right relationship to your imperfections. That relationship is one of acceptance, and that makes it possible to reunite with your divine perfection. The divine is deeply in love with the human just as it is, because the divine created the human to be just as it is. Acceptance is the bridge that takes you from the human condition of suffering to the freedom and love of your divine nature. Without acceptance, you are stuck in the ego and the suffering it creates. With acceptance, the ego is allowed to be as it is, while recognizing that you are not that ego. You accept that you have an ego that causes suffering, but you also know that who you are, in essence, is divine. That mysterious essence is what sees the truth about the ego. Then, after accepting and forgiving your humanness, there's one more very important thing to do. Don't go back to the thought stream. Stay in presence by staying in your body and senses and noticing the vast spaciousness from which you're looking, hearing, sensing, and experiencing. Notice it and sink into it. Remain in it. The only thing that can take you out of presence is the voice in your head. The longer you stay in presence, the more this spacious sense of your divine self opens up, and you discover how very satisfying and complete it is. To be happy, you don't need what the ego thinks you need. The joy of pure existence is there whenever you turn the spotlight of your attention onto it and keep it there long enough for the divine self to open, like a flower, and release its fragrance. The proof that you are not the ego, which is why you are able to accept the ego, is that you are aware of the ego. What is aware of the ego cannot be the ego. Just as the eye can't see itself, the ego can't see itself. Only something outside the ego can see the ego. You are able to be aware of what's going on within the human condition because you are not only human. You are, in fact, what is aware of everything: thoughts, feelings, desires, intuitions, the sense of aliveness and existence, drives, urges, inspiration, and everything in the external world that is brought to you through the sense organ that is your body-mind. This awareness is perfect, unadulterated, and cannot be harmed by any imperfection. Nothing your human self has ever done has harmed the perfection of your divine self. When you're in touch with this perfection and know yourself as this, you act accordingly, in peace, love, and kindness towards all. When this perfection infuses and is expressed through the human self, it is very beautiful indeed. But this doesn't do away with the ego, which will rise again and seek expression. Then awareness, acceptance, compassion, and forgiveness of the ego are called for again. This is the dance between the human self and the divine self that continues moment to moment. Always you, the one awakening from the egoic trance, must choose what you will express, who you will be in that moment. Will you be the ego-dominated human self or the divine-infused human self? With practice, choosing the divine self becomes much easier, but that choice must still be made. That choice eventually becomes habitual, just as ego identification was once habitual. But even then, the ego still exists in potential. Being in touch with perfection or presence is also the secret to happiness. When you're in presence, enjoying life is natural, because you have no judgments or desires for life to be any different than it is. When you have no judgments or desires, your circumstances can't upset you. You just enjoy life as it is. You fall into the moment. You lose your egoic self, and that's enjoyable enough. It's impossible to be ego-identified and be truly happy except briefly, because the ego is the manufacturer of discontentment, and by definition you can't be happy when you're discontent. Unless you accept life just as it is, you can't enjoy it, because you're too busy resisting or trying to change it. When you stop having that kind of relationship with life, you drop into presence and experience the natural enjoyment of the Divine Self. The Divine Self is glorying in its creation, every aspect of it. It loves the puddles, the rainbows, the garbage, the feasts, the broken things, and the shiny and new things equally. To the Divine Self, there is no difference between these. They are all rejoiced in. To the Divine Self, everything is good. Everything is the beloved, all part of itself, its own creation. If the ego felt this way about life, there would be nothing to desire, nothing to fear, and no better future moment to strive for. In other words, there would be little left of the ego, because you could say that desiring, fearing, striving, and looking to the future are the ego. If you were to cease doing these things, you would be in presence, and the ego would lose its power and place. The ego would still be there in the background, creating a sense of individuality so that you didn't fall into the oneness and forget you were playing at being a human being. All the ego is really needed for is that. Thank you for being here. I am with you always.